And unfortunately, there were many early Christians who got lured into the Gnostics, and John was very upset about that. There were other books that were considered false gospels, in that they're written by people other than the apostles that claim to be written by the apostles. Most of these were written like 100 years after the apostle they're supposed to be from died, so there's no way, in the case of the Gospel of Judas, that was the case. Judas was dead and gone a long time before that book was written, so he had nothing to do with the authorship of the Gospel of Judas. Plus, it's Judas. That wouldn't have gone very far if he had written a book. I don't think people would have been very interested in what he had to say. He was described by John as a thief. He was not described. Jesus said it would be better for him if he'd never been born. Okay? So to have another, to see, his point of view, and if he tries to make himself a hero, even if the Gospel of Judas were truly from Judas, it wouldn't have much credibility. And there are other books that aren't part of the current evangelical Christian canon that are part of like the Catholic's Bible. And there's not that these books are terrible and that there's disagreement about the historical validity of them. They just don't talk about God. So they don't really add or subtract anything from your faith. It's Jewish history. And so the Catholic Bible has those books. The Protestant Bible does not. It's not a big deal. Okay, it really isn't, because again, that doesn't add or subtract anything from one's spiritual doctrine. So they're making a big deal out of this when people who are actually Christians don't care. So why were the Gnostics considered such bad people? Why aren't they accepted by Christians? Well, their Gospels were rejected for a number of reasons. Gnostic Gospels were named after known Bible characters to justify their Gnostic doctrines. Essentially what they did was they took the name of known Bible characters and made a comic book about them, and then had them saying things that justified their twisted theology. You need to understand, Gnostic works contradicted both the Old and New Testament scriptures. This horrific contradiction. For example, the big example, the God of the Old Testament, now according to Jesus, according to the rest of the entire New Testament, for example, the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. We see him in a different light. We know him more intimately because, Jesus made him known. But in the Old Testament, we see a reflection of him, but we really don't know him very well through the prophets. When we get to Jesus, we get a clear vision, and so his love comes through a lot stronger. But it's the same God. It's the same God. In the Gnostic religion, the God of the Old Testament is described as an evil demon, and the serpent, the one that deceived Eve and Adam in the garden, is good. It's a hero. The Gnostic works were not associated with any of the apostles. In fact, the writings of the so-called Gnostic apostles were in contradiction to what the apostles said. Okay, and also the Gnostic writings often quote the Bible, okay? But the Bible never quotes Gnostic scriptures, okay? Ever. In Revelation chapter 2, Jesus talks about some of their teachings. He wasn't very happy. He said, "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allowed that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and all those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation until they repent of their deeds." Now, the churches at Pergamum and Thyatira were considered to be Proto-Gnostic movements. And so this is like the early Gnostic church. And these people were in the Christian church. I mean, that's kind of where they got started. And eventually they broke away. But they had influence on early Christianity. And the Apostle John and Jesus were very much opposed to what they were talking about. Because again, there's like, the flesh is evil and it's just bad and the spirit is good. So if you indulge your flesh, you're really not hurting yourself because it's not going to live anyway. So your spirit is perfectly good, and when you die, you'll be perfect and good, and your body will decay and nobody cares. And that's not biblical. According to the Bible, what we do with our body matters. It matters. Your body is part of you. Okay? And your behaviors, the things that you do with your body count. You're held responsible for that. So this division is not so clear-cut. Not that your body goes to heaven or hell, it's your spirit, but you will be responsible. You will be held responsible for what you do with your body. Gnostics didn't believe that. That is directly contradictory to the rest of the Bible. Now, the Gnostics teach that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That was an illusion. Okay, they're big into things like that. So he didn't rise from the dead because he never actually died. They call the Old Testament God the blind one. Another name they had for him was Demiurge, the lesser power. So completely inconsistent with the actual Bible. Now, most of their complaints are about those two books, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. I want to spend some time talking about the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered among the Nag Hammadi codices in Egypt in 1945. It was written somewhere between 120 AD and 200 AD. The actual Apostle Thomas went to India and he was martyred there. They ran him through with the spear, and that's how he died. And it was considerably before 120 AD, so probably didn't write the Gospel of Thomas, and if he did, he must have had brain damage. As a psychiatrist, one of the things that I have to assess in a patient is whether their thoughts are logical and goal-directed. I look for coherence. I look to see if they have something called adequate reality testing. Can you interpret reality correctly? Can you take your sensory information and your memory and integrate that stuff into a cohesive picture and understand how the real world works? Okay? People who are psychotic have difficulty with that. And yes, I am saying, based on my reading of the book of the Gospel of Thomas, the author does appear to be psychotic. I am familiar with many languages. In addition to English, I've been trained in Koine Greek, in German and French, and so I'm pretty good at interpreting what people are saying. Even if their English is really, really broken, I can usually make out what they're talking about. My first wife was from Iraq, so I've been around languages quite a bit. So I usually don't have trouble figuring out what people are saying, even if their language is fragmented and broken and poorly organized. The book of Thomas, this is not organized. I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to read from this, and you can too. So that you don't think I'm cherry picking these verses, you can just put in Google Book of Thomas and PDF, and you can read the Book of Thomas, and you will see that the whole thing reads kind of crazy. Here are some excerpts, starting here, verse 12. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you are going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "No matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." So, I don't know who James the Just is. If he's talking about James, his brother, that's a big deal. You don't see that anywhere in the Bible, that James, the brother of Jesus, was the whole purpose of God inventing heaven and earth. Whoa. Okay? That's news. Jesus said, "The kingdom is like a man who had a hidden treasure in his field without knowing it." Now, Jesus did give a parable that starts kind of like this, that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure in Ecca. He did say something like this. But this dude who got a hold of that verse, he turned it into something very different. I'll read it. "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who had a hidden treasure in his field without knowing it. After he died, he left it to his son. The son did not know about the treasure. He inherited the field and sold it. And the one who bought it went to plowing and found the treasure. He began to lend money at interest to whomever he wished." That's the end of the story. So, what's the moral of the story exactly? Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to something and tell me what I'm like." Now, doesn't Jesus sound a little vain here? Now, one time he did say to disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" Okay, you want to know, what are people saying about who I am? And that was kind of relevant. But here, it's like, compare me to something and tell me what I'm like. It's like, dude, insecure much? Really? Tell me what I'm like. What do you think of me? Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a just angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your teacher because you have drunk. You have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended." All right, so moral of the story is, I'm not your teacher because y'all are drunk on me. So the passage continues. Now keep in mind, he's talking to Thomas. Thomas is like, my mouth can't even say how good you are, man. And he took him. So what he means by him. So Jesus took Thomas and withdrew and spoke 3 sayings to him. When Thomas came back to his friends, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the sayings he spoke to me, you will pick up rocks and stone me, and fire will come out of the rocks and devour you." What? So Jesus said some things to me. He said 3 things, and I can't tell you any of it. If I tell even one thing to you, you're going to stone me, and when you stone me, them rocks are going to incinerate you because fire's going to come back and go whoosh. Does this not sound like a 7-year-old is playing a pretend game and making this up as he's going along? Mary said to Jesus, "What are your disciples like?" He said, "They are like little children living in a field that is not theirs. When the owners of the field come, they will say, 'Give us back our field.' They take off their clothes in front of them in order to give it back to them, and they return their field to them." So they're trespassing in some guy's field, and he catches them and tells them, "Leave my field." So they get naked and leave. Do you think that it offers an explanation after about why they got naked before they left? No, it ends there. Yeah, it ends there. Next one. Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, "These nursing babies are like those who enter the Father's domain." They said to him, "Then shall we enter the Father's domain as babies?" Jesus said to them, "When you make one into 2, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the Father's domain." That is so clear. Wow. I know exactly what to do. That's just, wow, that's beautiful. His disciples asked him and said to him, "Do you want us to fast? How should we pray? Should we give to charity? What diet should we observe?" Jesus said, "Don't lie and don't do what you hate." Wow. So fasting, giving to the poor. If you don't want to do it, if you hate, don't do it. Man, if that was a Bible verse, don't do what you hate. That would be one of the favorite Bible verses of all time. I hate paying taxes. Whoa. I hate getting up early in the morning for work. There's a lot of things like that. Bible says, if you hate it, don't do it. And he said, "The human one is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of little fish. Among them, the wise fisherman discovered a fine large fish. He threw all the little fish back into the sea and easily chose the large fish. Anyone with 2 good ears had better listen." I don't think the author understands fishing, okay? When you pull up fish, it's not a either or kind of thing. You get to keep all of them. You don't have to find, you pick one. I mean, it's like, it doesn't work like that. You only pick one. I don't know what country he's from, but maybe in their country, if you pull up a bunch of fish, you have to pick the best one and throw the rest back. It's just weird, right? I mean, I don't know where he came up with this illustration. Jesus said, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion still will become human." So, it's good if a human eats a lion. That lion is lucky because now his meat gets to be human, and so the lion is now human. But if the lion eats a human, well, that's bad luck. Probably bad luck for the human, I would imagine. But, because the lion still becomes human, because if the lion eats human meat, then the lion's now human. Yeah, that's so scientific. That's really, boy, I tell you, this Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, he's ahead of his time. I mean, he knows his science. Now, this is my favorite one of all. This is the last verse in the book of Thomas, and it's incredibly profound, and it introduces brand new doctrine, okay? Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Can you imagine that on a bumper sticker? Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the domain of heaven." Wow, is that news or what? What a doctrine that is. The only women that get to go to heaven are transvestites. Any non-transvestite woman doesn't have a chance. So only heaven is for males. Women don't go. They're evil, according to Peter. And Jesus, I guess, agreed with him, because he said in order for a woman to make it into heaven, she has to be converted into a man. So, when these liberal scholars they start whining and crying, "Yeah, you guys don't accept the book of Thomas, and you don't accept the book of Judas, and so you guys are all evil, and you're trying to make Christianity say stuff that only you like, and you're excluding this other stuff. It's all fake, because you're just making this up. We don't know what Jesus said." And it's like, look, you idiots. This stuff is nonsense. Okay, the book of Thomas is obviously nonsense, obviously written by somebody with mental problems, okay? Anybody with half a brain can see that if you read it. But they present this stuff, confuse the heck out of kids in college, all right, who think that these books are just as coherent as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're nowhere near coherent, okay? Anybody, even if these councils have been made up of 6th graders, they could have figured out that this stuff was wacky. Okay, so anyway, their contention that these books were accepted widely by the early Christians is bull. The early Christians did not accept the Gnostic teachings. They did not. So these councils, by excluding this, for some churches who may not have known better, if those books were in their canons, and that is true, that is possible, it's time to kick them out. Take a look at what it's saying. You don't want that. You don't want that to confuse you, because it's saying stuff that is opposite of the Old Testament and everything that the apostles were saying. Okay? All right. Now, when people become psychotic, most of the time, there are many ways that the brain can be damaged and result in psychosis. There was no treatment for mental illness back in those days. Whenever you have excessive dopamine release in an area of the brain called the associative striatum, you end up with difficulties in reality testing. Things seem significant that are absolutely, positively insignificant. Now, the Gospel of Judas I'm not going to go into the detail on the Gospel of Judas. It also is very difficult to read. And in the Gospel of Judas, Judas is the hero. And, if you think that, that should have been included, and it's probably just as good as these other Gospels, just go ahead, look at the PDF, read it, and you'll understand why it's not there. It's not as off as the Gospel of Thomas, but there's so much of it that isn't there. There are huge sections that are missing. We just don't have, we don't have multiple copies. The early Christians didn't copy the Gospel of Judas over and over again, probably for a good reason. Okay, but it presents Judas as a hero. Jesus wanted him to turn him in, because Jesus wanted to be freed of this physical body, because the body is evil, and he needed Judas to betray him so that he could become spirit again. And then on the other side of their mouth, they're saying, well, his body was an illusion anyway. So which is it? That's an internal inconsistency. So Gnosticism was a heretical teaching that salvation came through a secret knowledge. Supposedly Judas was the transmitter of that knowledge, according to Gnosticism. Matter was evil and was created by the Old Testament God, who was also evil. Spirit, though, was good. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus tells Judas, referring to the other apostles, "But you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The clothes reference presumably refers to Jesus' body. They deny the resurrection, and that's a big problem, because the resurrection validates that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And that's why, when I talk about the evidence for the Christian model, I refer people to the talk that I do on the Shroud of Turin. It's not the only evidence for the resurrection, but I firmly believe it's the most incontrovertible evidence that there is. It's very strong. You please watch it if you haven't seen it already, because if you can understand the strength of the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, then it validates that he was who he claimed to be. And that this is real. This whole picture of humanity that he presents is real. That we've got a sin problem, and God understands that, and he was willing to die and pay for everybody's sin, and he did that. And then to validate that he was God come down here to pay for everybody, he rose from the dead, something that is impossible. It violates the laws of biology, the laws of physics, everything. Only God can do that kind of thing, and he did it. Okay, so whatever anybody says, all other voices on earth, nobody's ever done anything like that. Therefore, his voice is the most important one. When it comes to figuring out what the afterlife is like, I am more likely to listen to somebody who validated that they have supernatural power compared to all these other people with absolutely no evidence that they know what they're talking about with regard to God. All right. Lastly, with regard to the authorship of the Gospels, I do want to spend a little bit of time on this. They state emphatically that none of the Gospels came with an about the author section. The closest we get to a claim of authorship is at the very end of the book of John, where the author implies that the book was written by the disciple that Jesus loved. And so John is the one that's most clear about who the author was. And most people agree that the book of John was written by the Apostle John. So remember, in that video, the guy was saying that there's no way that the apostles could have written the Gospels down because they were too stupid. They were from a country where only 10% of the population knew how to read. Well, let's examine that, shall we? All right, let's start with Matthew. Now, who was, according to church history, according to the Bible, Matthew was a former tax collector. Okay? His other name was Levi, so probably Matthew from the tribe of Levi, so they called him by his last name, or they call him Matthew. In the book of Matthew, he calls himself Matthew. In the other Gospels, they call him Levi. Now, to be a tax collector for the Roman Empire, do you think knowing how to read and write might be helpful? That's just stupid to even question that. If you're a tax collector, you need to know how to read and write. If you got to write people's names down and how much they gave, okay, you got to write notes, who owes what and so forth. You don't know how to read, that's going to be a handicap. All right, so what's more likely, that Matthew, the tax collector for Rome, doesn't know how to read and write, or that he does? What's to stop it from being translated into Greek by other Christians later? So basically, their contention that it could not possibly have been written by the Apostle Matthew because only 10% of the people could read and write. Who do you think those 10% were? People like tax collectors would probably be in the 10%. Now, all three of the Synoptic Gospels in the book of Acts describe Matthew as among the 12 disciples. It's only in the book of Matthew that he is specifically described as the tax collector. Now, the earliest external evidence that Matthew wrote the Gospels comes from a 4th century historian named Eusebius, and he quotes Papias, a 2nd century church father. Papias and Polycarp were followers of the Apostle John. And he said that Matthew compiled, arranged, or composed the oracles in Hebrew or Aramaic language, and everyone interpreted them as best as they could to their other languages. So Papias comes right out and says that, yeah, Matthew wrote it, but he wrote it or transcribed it in Hebrew or Aramaic. So who am I going to believe? Some Yahoo liberal scholar from 1967, or Papias, who knew John personally, the Apostle John, who said that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew? In that video, they made it sound like the early Christians had no idea who wrote the book of Matthew. The early Christians were led by the actual apostles. Do you not think that John would tell them who wrote the book? Really? Another thing to consider is that the Gospel of Matthew talks more about money than any other gospel. Is that something a tax collector would do, right? The parable of the talents is only found in Matthew. Gold and silver are mentioned 28 times in the Gospel of Matthew, but they're only mentioned once in Mark and 4 times in Luke. In the Lord's Prayer, the author of Matthew says, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," whereas the author of Luke says, "Forgive us our sins as we also forgive everyone who sins against us." So Matthew kind of speaks in tax collector language. Now think about also, why would the church fathers ascribe this book to Matthew? Matthew was not a prominent apostle, okay? So why would they just make that up? What good does it do them to just pick him like that? Okay? I mean, why would they just lie? So that's what, you ever heard the term, whoever smelt it, dealt it? Okay? Me thinkest thou protesteth too much. So, when you accuse people of deception a lot, that tells me that you use deception as a manipulation tool a lot yourself. You are basically projecting your own sin onto other people. So when these people walk around talking about, oh, they just made it up, they're trying to improve their credibility, it's like, why do you think that way? Why would you? So you think that the early Christians just lied all the time? Really? So let's skip over to the next book, Mark. Okay, now Mark was not written directly by an apostle, but he was written by proxy. Peter actually gave Mark the information, and then John Mark was his full name, according to Eusebius. Eusebius is a church historian, and according to Eusebius, Papias claimed that John the Elder, or the Apostle John, told Papias that John Mark had written it. Okay, so kind of the same deal. Church fathers who knew the apostles personally are the ones that said that the book of Mark was written by John Mark, and John Mark is described in the book of Luke. All right, and so John Mark became Peter's interpreter, and so he was Peter's traveling companion and interpreter, and Peter gave him the history, and then John Mark composed the book of Mark based on what Peter transcribed to him. So to recap, Eusebius from the 4th century tells us that Papias, a 1st century church father, said that John the Elder, the Apostle John, told Papias that John Mark wrote the gospel based on the Apostle Peter's reminiscences. Papias claims Mark became the interpreter of Peter. Is it reasonable to believe that Mark was literate? If only 10% of the people of Israel were able to read and write, does it make sense that an interpreter might be literate? Okay. Is it impossible that Peter's interpreter would be literate? Okay. It's just really, okay. And next is Luke. Luke was what? A physician? Do you think physicians might... Now, Luke was not... I don't think Luke was Jewish even. Luke was a Gentile. He was a Gentile physician. And, and you ask, because he made, the author of that YouTube video made it sound like all 4 were just backwoods hick disciples of Jesus, and it's not true. John Mark was not a disciple of Jesus, but he was an interpreter who worked with the Apostle Peter, and Luke was a physician who was an acquaintance of the Apostle Paul. So, to call him to say, oh, for sure he was illiterate because 10%, I don't think that the interpreters, the physicians, and the tax collectors classified as people that were illiterate. So Luke was the early church credits the Gospel of Luke to Paul's companion Luke. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, and others all list Luke, the Dr. Luke, as the author of the book of Luke. Luke is mentioned throughout Paul's letters, where we learn that he's a doctor. At the beginning of Luke, the author appears to claim not to be an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, but rather someone who has spoken to eyewitnesses and investigated their claims. This is what Luke says in the 1st chapter, verses 1 through 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you will know with certainty the things you have been taught. So church tradition tells us that Luke was a converted Gentile, which scholars suggest is the reason that Paul introduces him separately in Colossians 4, before he introduces his Jewish companions first, and then he saves Luke for last. Okay. So next, John. John was a fisherman. So the Apostle John, who became the the pastor for the church at Ephesus, the bishop of Ephesus. Here's just, how do you go from being a fisherman to the pastor of a church? And how do we know that he was literate? A church father named Eusebius quoted Polycrates, an even older church father, who said that John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle John, was a priest. We can say with relative certainty that the apostle John, who was also called the beloved disciple or the other disciple, likely had a tie with the priest, which would explain a verse in John 18, verses 15 through 16, which says that he was known by the high priest. And this is when Jesus was taken to the high priest to be charged and tortured. While he was there, Peter and John go into the courtyard and warm themselves by the fire. They welcome John in because he was known to the high priest. It says Simon Peter followed along behind, as did the other of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the courtyard with Jesus. So that other disciple is John. Now, why did the high priest know him? Because if Polycrates is correct, John, the son of Zebedee, was a priest. Okay? And since John took over he became the bishop of the church at Ephesus, reading and writing might be useful for a job like that. All right, so I'm going to stop here because this is just a lot of information, and I hate making these things so long, but I want to be thorough. So for people that make the claim that, how do you know that Jesus really said those things? How do you know those values that are in the Bible right now? How do you know that Jesus said those things and not other things? How can we be sure that the Bible hasn't changed? All right. And, the number, the sheer volume of copies is when John became the bishop of the church at Ephesus, he encouraged his followers to start making copies of the Holy Scriptures. Okay, Polycarp was one of his big disciples, and Polycarp later became the bishop himself. And Polycarp spent a lot of time transcribing and copying the New Testament scriptures and sending them all over the place. Okay? All of these copies that then got copied and copied and copied, when you have thousands of copies all over the known Roman world, you can easily put together what most likely the original had to say. When you have over 99% congruence, when they agree that much, okay? So the news is not, well, there are some variances in these texts. They didn't have computers, man. There were no Xerox machines. They did it by hand. And so there were missteps. There were typos. That did happen. The Bible, nowhere in the Bible does it say that all of the copies would be perfect. And if you were taught that in church, well, that's just wrong. But we have so many copies, and also the major doctrines in the New Testament, those moral values, are repeated over and over and over and over again in like every book. Okay, so it's not a mystery as to what is sin and what isn't sin. It's not a mystery. It's said repeatedly. We don't have to depend on one or two verses. So yeah, I think we can be very confident that the values in the Bible that we have today are essentially the values that Jesus talked about 2,000 years ago. The words that he said, for the most part, are exactly what he meant to say in the scriptures that we have today. Okay? So I hope that clears things up for you. The liberal scholars will do their best to confuse people, and the people that will be most confused are those that don't investigate their claims, but take what they say on face value. But as you can see, when you dig in, when you investigate what they're saying, it's very obvious that they are trying to make you doubt. They sit there with a smug look on their face, or the scholars. Well, they're only the scholars because on college campuses, Orthodox scholars are not given a voice, but they do have something to say. So please watch that video that I said. If you can get a hold of the movie, The Case for Christ, they go into other information like that. Watch my videos on the Shroud of Turin, and you'll see the evidence in support of the validity of the claims of Christ and the validity of Scripture and everything, okay? So I hope this helps. I hope this helps clear up some doubt that you might be struggling with. Thank you for watching.